Right, now we're going to mix our colours. First I'm going to mix the grass. I'm going to start with cadmium yellow, a lot of cadmium yellow. I'm going to put a tiny bit of phthalo green with that. Start with the yellow, add the green. That way you can create a realistic green, but if you start with the green and add the yellow, you'll never get the right colour. And then add a little bit of burnt sienna, and what that does is it just gives it that realism, that credibility, so it's not an absolutely perfect out of the tube green. Add brown. So there's our grass. The next is the water. I'm going to start with phthalo blue. Any phthalo blue will do. This one's called tropical phthalo. I'm adding rose madder to make it into a violet. And we've got a little bit of green on the brush still. So there's our water, and I'm going to add a tiny little bit of burnt sienna, and that should give us a dirty blue for the water. Next I'm going to do the backdrop. This is the wooded backdrop, French ultramarine and burnt umber. I'll put these two together to create a brown. A little bit of rose madder in the mix, and that'll be ready to create our woodland colour. So first we'll put the grass on, wet the paper, plenty of water, and there goes the grass colour. Next, we'll wet the whole of the water area, and now the masking for the blossom comes into its own, and that'll protect the blossom from the water as we paint it on. Now I'm just going to take the wet wash of the water almost up to the grass, but not quite. So we've wet the paper, but we haven't touched on to the wet grass area. Now we find our colour. Test it out, just a little bit more blue, and we put the water in. And as we brush this up into the blossom, the masking does most of the work, and we can basically brush the water across most of the blossom. I am just leaving a couple of highlights here and there, but that will do the job for us. So adding a little bit of colour now to the base of the water, so the bottom of the water is always darker. Now before it dries, I'm just going to join it onto the grass like that, and that should give us a grassy, soft edge there. Now we put the water in over here. There's just a little bit to go in, and the same applies. Join it up to the grass, and we'll have a nice soft edge. That will bring some grass over here for later. Now I'm going to just brush water gently across the backdrop here. What I've done is I've just dry brushed the water across and left a few gaps, and now when we brush the woodland in, it'll merge on the paper. Some of the paper is dry, some of the paper is wet, and you can just see how by quickly dry brushing the paint into the water area, we've got ourselves a distant woodland. And now it's just a matter of finishing off some of the areas, some of the dark, distant foliage areas with this colour, so we can get the distance. Now for the reflection, we just get this distant woodland colour and we can drag it straight down into the water like that. and leave it to dry. So we've got a beginnings of a bit of reflection, and I've worked that wet in wet into the water. Now we'll let that dry, and later on we'll come back to that. Now we can put a little bit of dark into the grass, dark shadows, so I'm going to use the dark woodland colour and mix it with a bit of green, and we just run in some shadows like that. Look at that, just wet and wet, let it blend. Where necessary you can add a bit of water to it. And that's the crisscross labyrinth of shadows cast by the bright sun, and that starts to give us the pattern for the grass. I'll do it with a little bit more burnt sienna. And I'm dashing some burnt sienna in there for the woodland foliage and all the undergrowth. Now we can start to do the very, very dark accents within the blossom and leave the water to dry. So I'm using the French ultramarine and burnt umber mix, and these are the darks within the blossom area itself. So here we go, we just put the dark shadow using exactly the same technique which we used for the blossom. And we can add to the reflection in the water as that dries, because what we're really seeing within the dark areas is the shadow within the blossom tree, but we're also seeing the distant woodland where it's showing through as a dark mass of foliage. So now the darks within the blossom start to highlight all the lights and the colours that we've saved. Now I'm just going to put a few jagged lines through the tree for the branches. So here we go. Now obviously a lot of that will just disappear when we come to take off the masking, and the branches should appear to weave in and out where the masking is removed. So we're painting that right across the masking. Add a little bit more colour to the grass, shadows. We've got an interesting back run that's formed around the edge there. That's quite nice. It looks grassy, so I can leave that. And we now need to dry it off, finish the water and remove the masking.